Hi, and thank you for tuning into the Nature Conversations podcast. I'm Dr Adam Forbes. I'm a forest ecologist who specialises in the restoration of New Zealand's forest ecosystems. This podcast isn't about me, however. The purpose of the Nature Conversations podcast is to capture knowledge and insights from remarkable people and to profile important issues for ecology and nature conservation. In this episode, I welcome Dr Kate McAlpine onto the podcast. Kate is a leading weed ecologist and is a science advisor at the New Zealand Department of Conservation. She has researched weeds and weed ecology comprehensively across New Zealand. Her publications span the impacts and dispersal of weeds, native seedling recruitment in the presence of weeds and mammals, and native plant succession in woody weed stands.
I often get asked, what's the worst weed in New Zealand? And there's no simple answer because it depends where you are. What's the site like? What's the natural vegetation? How does it compare to this weed in that place? What impact is that weed having? And so, the worst weed in one place might not be a problem in another. Unfortunately, there's a huge pool of potential weeds in New Zealand. We've got, current weeds, there's about 400 species on that new list of environmental weeds, and those are the ones that we already know are having significant impacts in our natural environments. There are about another 1,800 species that have already started to naturalise, so they're already showing up in the wild as seedlings. We don't know yet what sort of impact they're going to have. But, and this is the big one, we also have at least 25,000 other species of exotic plants already present in New Zealand, mostly still in people's gardens.
It's my pleasure to welcome Kate McAlpine to the Nature Conversations podcast. How are you today, Kate?
Good, thank you, Adam.
Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I'm very excited to have you here. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Could you tell me a little bit about your professional background and what led your career to focus on weeds?
Well, weeds is actually my second career, or possibly third if you count a couple of years as a bartender in the beginning of my working life. But I was actually in business administration and human resources before I decided that I wanted to be a scientist, either a bird scientist or a plant scientist. So I went back to university, did a Bachelor of Science, then straight into honours, and then PhD on the invasive plant Darwin's barberry. And I chose weeds over native plants or birds for largely pragmatic reasons. Weeds are much easier to study. They're easy to find, they grow really fast, and they don't fly away. And because I also figured that there would be more jobs in weeds. And I was really lucky to get my current job at DOC, the Department of Conservation, when I was partway through my PhD. And I'm in the same job 23 years later.
Fabulous, Kate. That's excellent. Thanks for outlining that. I know there's a bit of terminology probably good to get clear to start with. What's the difference between a weed and an environmental weed?
A weed is a much more general term, and you can define it any way you like. And actually that's a good point. It really is a human concept. We decide what is a weed, i.e. a plant that we don't want in a particular place for whatever reason. The thing that most people will be familiar with is a home gardener, as many people will be, pulling out a plant that they don't want in their garden, whether it's because it's arrived there by itself and doesn't fit their plan for the garden, or even if it's something that they did buy and plant themselves, but it subsequently has taken over and is starting to push out their other pretty plants. So in that very general sense, you could just call it a weed, an unwanted plant, or a plant in the wrong place for whatever reason. When we talk about environmental weeds, that is from the perspective of the environment or our natural ecosystems and vegetation types. So an environmental weed is a plant that's having a negative impact on our natural ecosystems and native species. So it's disrupting the balance at a particular site or becoming dominant in an ecosystem to the extent that that ecosystem is no longer able to function in a way that enables it to sustain the life that does belong there. And in the recent update of the list of environmental weeds in New Zealand, we had very specific criteria for inclusion, and that was we included species if they were fully naturalised. So that means that they have a self-sustaining population in the wild. They were present in natural ecosystems, so native forests, wetlands, etc., as opposed to agricultural systems, for example, and that were having significant impact in those natural ecosystems. So we excluded things that didn't occur in the wild, in natural ecosystems, and that didn't really have a major impact. So, for example, a tiny dandelion that really only occurs in farmland wouldn't have made the cut. So that was quite specific criteria, and that would probably be the best way to describe what we mean by an environmental weed. But there's a lot of scope for broadening or narrowing that definition depending on your perspective.
Sure, no, that all makes a lot of sense. Thanks very much for explaining those different definitions, Kate. So it strikes me that there's an element of subjectivity to this. Are there any plants that come to mind which are simply a matter of perspective as to whether they are classed as valuable or weedy?
Tons. And gorse is one that people might be familiar with, that is on the baddie list for farmers because it takes over pasture and destroys grazing land. But actually it can be seen as beneficial in native ecosystems, particularly regenerating native forest, because it can act as a nurse species for native seedlings to establish. So that's a very different perspective on the same weed. Another example that's been in the media a little bit lately, almost every year it does, is Taiwan cherry, because it has these spectacular flowers in early spring that attracts masses of tuis. And so people are very reluctant to believe that this is a weed in the wild because they don't want to get rid of it because of its effect on the bird life. Another issue that can depend on perspective is the concept of native plant species becoming weedy. And we have a bunch of these in New Zealand. So native species that become overly dominant when they establish outside their natural range is what we call it. So the distribution that the plant had before humans arrived is what we mean by natural range, so where something occurs naturally. And this can be a tricky concept. For starters, knowing exactly what that natural range was before people got here can be difficult to decide, particularly for species that were subsequently moved around a lot by humans once we did arrive. And it's also tricky because people often think, well, how can a native plant be a weed? Aren't natives good, exotics bad? And the answer to that is it depends, as is often the answer with any question in ecology. And I recently pulled together a collaborative paper on the tree karaka, which is one such native species in New Zealand, endemic to New Zealand, that can become overly dominant in areas outside its natural range. And the paper came out of a wānanga that was held at Zealandia here in Wellington, that aimed to bring together all the different perspectives on karaka, to have everybody hear each other's perspective and figure out a way forward. And So karaka is an interesting case because it has an added layer of complexity alongside whether it's weedy outside its natural range or not, because it has huge cultural significance to Māori and Moriori. When they arrived in New Zealand from Polynesia, a lot of the crops that they brought from Polynesia failed to thrive in our much colder conditions. So karaka became an important food crop once they learnt how to process the fruits to remove the toxicity of the kernels. And so this species was extensively moved around New Zealand by Māori and Moriori and on the Chathams. And they planted trees and groves wherever they settled, and these trees were carefully tended, named often, seen as part of the whakapapa. And you can still see a lot of the remnants of these planted groves around the place today. So its natural range is generally thought to be north of Waikato, but it's now present all around the North Island, mostly coastal areas, but inland as well, and including most of the offshore islands, along with the top half of the South Island, and on the Chathams, of course, where it's known as Kopi. And on the Chathams, it's got additional spirituality and significance to Moriori because they inscribed the bark of Kopi trees with ancestral figures and other designs, not by carving the bark, more like bruising it, and creating these amazing, unique and globally significant dendroglyphs known as rako mamori. Now, basically memorials to ancestors and past events, so hugely culturally significant. Sadly, though, because these were created on living trees, the rako mamori are slowly disappearing as the trees grow and the bark expands. And of course, the trees eventually die. And in 2011, the very difficult decision was made to cut down a number of trees to preserve the section of the bark that had the rako mamori on them. And you can see photos of that in the karaka paper that we'll post in the links of the podcast. So you've got this cultural and spiritual significance to Māori and Moriori, but it's also a species where it can become very dominant, particularly in the understory. You see a typical carpet of seedlings beneath a karaka tree. They have these big fruit that are able to establish and survive in the seed for quite some time, and so potentially are pushing out other native species, some of which might be endemic to that area. So despite some people thinking that natives should never be called a weed, when you think of it from that perspective, from sort of a local scale, where you might have native species that only occur in that area, so are locally endemic, and you've got this, yes, native species coming in from out of town and pushing those local endemics out. It's a slightly different perspective. An additional layer of complexity with karaka is that it's highly toxic to dogs. So dog owners hate it. Dogs are very attracted to the sweet smelling fruits, and they can hoover up a large amount in a short time and can even die from it. So karaka is an interesting example of a species that there's all these human values, cultural practices, environmental concerns are all interacting and can be at odds. So it's not a black and white issue of is this a weed or is it not. It depends where you are and a whole bunch of other things. There are other native species that do the same thing, can be overly dominant outside their natural range, but it's got that added layer of difficulty in trying to define whether something's a weed or not when compared to exotic species, where it's easy to say, okay, this does not belong in New Zealand, it's causing a problem, let's call it a weed.
It's very interesting, Kate, and I think In a number of cases, the really interesting issues in ecology come when they interface with social dynamics and personal preferences and human preferences, don't they?
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you for outlining that for us. That's excellent. Could you give us an example of what you'd consider a very problematic weed in New Zealand and how you go about managing that weed?
Yeah, well, again, the answer is, I'm afraid, it depends. I mean, I often get asked, what's the worst weed in New Zealand? And there's no simple answer because it depends where you are. What's the site like? What's the natural vegetation? How does it compare to this weed in that place? What impact is that weed having? And so, the worst weed in one place might not be a problem in another. So, for example, if you're a black stilt threatened by Russell lupins on a braided river in the South Island, then Russell lupins is your number one baddie. If you are a snow tussock threatened by wilding conifers in the high country of the South Island, then the wilding conifer is your baddie. And certainly wilding conifers would be probably the biggest problem we have in New Zealand now, both in terms of hectares affected, cost to control and potential impact. Weeds can have a whole bunch of different impacts on, from displacing native plants, changing abiotic conditions at a site, such as soil chemistry or hydrology. And some plants have long-lasting effects and completely transform an ecosystem, and wilding conifers is, as a group, is probably one of the biggest in that respect, particularly when they're occurring in tussock grasslands in the South Island, for example. So radically different life form to the native plants that live there, and very difficult to get back to that native vegetation once you've got a stand of conifers there. And the worst weed can vary not just by site, but also by time. You might look at a site now that's completely covered with, I'll try not to keep using gorse as an example, because there are lots of other woody weeds that behave like gorse, that look like they completely dominate the site from a distance. But if you have a look in the understory, often you'll see it's completely native, and sometimes a very dense native understory. That's another piece of work I did, looking at a whole bunch of sites around the country with a whole bunch of different woody weeds that dominated the canopy, and sort of tried to outline how, by what you see in the understory, tells you what the future is of the vegetation at that site could be, as long as you don't have further disturbance. So a site that is covered in an exotic woody weed tree that has a native understory could be on the trajectory back to native succession. So that's one example of how weed impacts can change over time, and what you see today isn't necessarily what you're going to see in 10 years or 50 years or 100 years. You often are looking at quite long time frames when you think about succession. And the decision to manage a weed or not is also not straightforward, and depends on a whole range of factors, such as what the land tenure is, who owns or manages the land, and what the values are of that person or group or organisation, what the impact of the weed is at that site, and what values are being affected, because, as I mentioned before, that could differ by different sites. Depends on whether we've got suitable control methods available, and what impact that control method is likely to have on other species present, whether you've got sufficient resources to manage that weed at a site, and what's likely to happen next after you've removed that weed. How likely is it to reinvade, or are you just creating a beautiful weed-shaped hole for somebody else to arrive and dominate the site? So yeah, and a lot of those questions can be very difficult to answer, and we've often resorted to making our best guess. But yeah, another major factor is how big is the site that you're trying to control, and it is incredibly difficult to eradicate a weed at a large site. Anything more than a few hectares is incredibly difficult and expensive.
Great, Kate. It's a complicated picture, and I think you're doing a great job of explaining that to the listeners. And it would be really nice, I think, to link in the work that you referred to about natives and the understory of weeds. I think if we could put a link in the podcast description for that people might find that very interesting as well. So, I mean, yourself and others have obviously been working on cataloguing existing weeds and working on the issues around them. But are new weeds establishing, and if so, where are they coming from? What do we know about that?
Yes, there are new weeds establishing all the time. We know that most of these come from people's gardens. The vast majority of environmental weeds in New Zealand were originally brought here as garden plants and eventually jumped the fence, so to speak, and spread into the wild. And this is evident from the recent update in the list of environmental weeds in New Zealand that I mentioned before. We added 112 new species to this list. The last time it was published was in 2008. So that's actually not that surprising that there are that many new species added in the last 15 years. But unfortunately, there's a huge pool of potential weeds in New Zealand. We've got, current weeds, there's about 400 species on that new list of environmental weeds, and those are the ones that we already know are having significant impacts in our natural environments. There are about another 1,800 species that have already started to naturalise, so they're already showing up in the wild as seedlings. We don't know yet what sort of impact they're going to have. But, and this is the big one, we also have at least 25,000 other species of exotic plants already present in New Zealand, mostly still in people's gardens. And there's very few barriers to establishment, and of course climate change possibly will make things even better for weeds to establish. So yeah, it's going to be an ever-increasing list. The minute the current list was published, I started creating a list of new things that we, probably should have added to the current one, but we didn't hear about them in time. The intention is to update that every couple of years, and I would guess that there'll be at least another 20 species added in 2 years' time. But also, none of our current weeds occupy anything like 100% of their potential range. Even gorse, which is you'd think is everywhere, isn't everywhere. So yes, there'll be new weeds arriving from a national perspective, but also from a regional perspective. There are lots of weeds in other regions that could establish in your region, for example. So there's a lot of potential species coming down the pipeline, and some areas are more prone to invasion than others, although any region is vulnerable, particularly but not exclusively following land disturbance. So any areas that are disturbed are very vulnerable to weed invasion, and climate change, as I mentioned, is likely to exacerbate this, particularly the disturbance that is caused by an increase in the number and intensity of storm events, but also the increasing winds and flooding also tends to spread weed seeds around. And of course, another factor of climate change is temperature. Warming temperatures is likely to enable some tropical species, for example, palm trees, to be able to extend their range south. On the other hand, it may also cause distribution to shrink for some species if they're cold adapted. So lots of new weeds potentially coming into New Zealand. Well, not coming in, they're already here. It's actually been really difficult to introduce new species since the Hazardous Substances and New Organism Act was introduced, and I can't remember what date off the top of my head, a long time ago. So we're not that worried about people introducing new species. It's more about keeping an eye on the species that we've got in the country already and getting our ducks lined up so that we've got a system for detecting them early when they do first jump the fence. Because if we can pick them up early, that means we can control them quickly and cheaply and before they've had a major impact on biodiversity.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. It's rather daunting, isn't it, Kate? The way you describe that is it's a very significant issue for New Zealand's environment, quite clearly.
Indeed. Yes.
Yeah, and it I think brings us on to the topic of some of the more current work that you are doing, I understand, with the Smart Weed Alert tool. Sounds like a really important part of what you've just described in terms of surveillance and keeping on top of the situation. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. The interesting thing is, despite this huge pool of current and potential weeds, remember that 25,000 species sitting in the garden, with us having no idea which are going to jump the fence, we actually don't have a good system for detecting new weeds early. Mostly we rely on luck. So just about the only time we ever pick up a new weed is if somebody knowledgeable just happens to notice and just happens to know that that species is new to New Zealand or to the region. Yeah, so it's not ideal, but of course we just don't have the resources to have enough boots on the ground for people to be carrying out manual surveillance to pick up new weeds when they first invade. And as I mentioned, early detection is critical because once something becomes widespread, actually not even that widespread, anything more than a couple of hectares, as I mentioned earlier, is really difficult to eradicate. And depending on what sort of habitat that it's arrived into, it can do a lot of damage, even in a small area in a relatively short time if it's a fragile ecosystem or with vulnerable species in there. So the Smart Weed Alert tool, or SWAT, is a digital online tool that I'm developing with Nigel Charman in Wellington, and it will help with this problem by making use of weed data that's already been collected in a number of places, including on iNaturalist, the nature recording app that's freely available. It will analyse new records that are posted to places like iNaturalist, analyse them against the background of the current weed distribution to see whether it is new for any given area. And so people will be able to set up their highly specific weed alerts based on the things that are of interest to them, whether it's an area or a type of weed, and we'll be able to get an alert when something significant turns up. And so the strength of it will be you'll only get an alert for something that you might actually do something about. You know, there's no point getting an alert for the 500th record of gorse in Miramar, for example. And another strength of the Smart Weed Alert tool is that you'll be able to set up an alert to say, tell me anytime any new species is recorded for the first time or first few times in this area that I have defined. And you don't have to know what you're looking for. And that, of course, is a strength when we don't want to have to specify 25,000 species that we know are here. We just want to know anytime something new turns up. So that should be a really powerful tool. And so iNaturalist users out there, I encourage you to keep recording plants because anytime you do that from now on, that record, once it has its identity confirmed, that will feed into this national weed surveillance tool, Smart Weed Alert tool. So your records will actually be used and we'll be able to send out feedback and create little stories to show when a significant new record is picked up. And I'm hoping that will incentivise people to keep recording stuff on iNaturalist, which of course will improve our knowledge of weed distributions, which in turn will mean the Smart Weed Alert tool will get more powerful and more accurate. And so we'll have this cycle of constant improvement. This will be world-leading technology, and I still can't quite believe it hasn't already been done somewhere in the world, because every country that has the luxury of worrying about weeds has the same problem. There's no way to detect new weeds early unless you get lucky. Still relies on people on the ground, of course, taking observations of plants, but that's what we've got at the moment. There's some scope for remote sensing to detect some weeds that are really obvious against their background, such as wilding conifer and tussock grassland, but mostly remote detection won't be an option for most of the weeds that are problematic in New Zealand. So watch this space for that.
Great, Kate. And I'm really impressed. It's such a neat application of citizen science that you're working on there as well. It's really great. And I think we'll include the link to iNaturalist in the podcast description. So if there's any budding weed spotters out there, then they might be able to contribute to your project and help everyone, really. It sounds really good.
Yeah, no, that would be good. And I mean, iNaturalist is really easy and fun to use, particularly to learn about what you're actually seeing out in the field. And another strength of the alert tool is it doesn't actually matter whether you know if you're looking at a weed or a native plant. So people don't even have to know about the Smart Weed Alert tool to be contributing.
Awesome. Thanks for taking the initiative and working on that topic. That sounds really valuable. Just before we finish off, I just wanted to ask you a bit of a fun question, I guess. You strike me as someone that would have spent a lot of time working in the field and I just wondered whether there were any moments that you've had out in the field, whether they be fun times, sentimental times, scary things that have happened that you might want to share with the listeners.
I'll start with the bad, and that is, finding myself scrabbling around underneath gorse thinking, I picked the wrong career, and also almost deciding to study blackberry and getting, a few metres into a blackberry stand before realising, I don't think this is a goer. But sort of certainly a memorable epiphany as such was in relation to this concept of the understory of a woody weed stand giving you a pretty solid indication of what the next generation at that site's going to be like. And just sort of going around the country and immersing myself in these understories, often under a very tall canopy of, Douglas fir, for example, and just being in this dense native understory, which if you didn't know there was a Douglas fir above you, you wouldn't think, you'd think you were in a native forest. And just that sort of light bulb realising that, okay, when those Douglas fir slowly start to die, the next candidate for canopy species is sitting here right now and it's going to shoot off. It's common sense really, and I am still surprised that hadn't been, documented as such in a really clear message to say, hey, before you go and decide to chop down that stand of woody weed, have a look in the understory and see what's going on and then make a plan, because it can be extremely variable and not necessarily what you would expect.
Okay, and we'll definitely link in your work in that space as well in the podcast description. Is there anything else that you'd like to say to the listeners before we sign off?
Having worked in the world of weeds, and it can ruin your holidays a little bit, but it's interesting from a cultural perspective, and thinking about our very special native plants. And there's just so much interesting historical detail as well as ecological detail in what you're seeing out in your natural environment. So I encourage people to open their eyes and wonder, even if you wonder about one plant every time you're out, and take a photo and load it to iNaturalist, which is really easy. That would be awesome.
Great, Kate. That's awesome. Look, I just would like to thank you for giving your time to come on the podcast. I think that the work you're doing is clearly really important, and I just encourage you to keep up the great work.
Thanks, Adam.
Okay, thanks very much, Kate. Thanks for joining me.
Yes.
Kate has mastered the topic of weeds, including all its inherent complexities, be they biotic, abiotic, or sociocultural. She works in an area of immense uncertainty. Kate described the likelihood of discovering emerging weeds as largely being dependent on luck and good fortune, and recognising this as working to enhance preparedness with an internationally unique application of citizen science through the SWAT project. Kate described what I found to be somewhat of a daunting process of updating a growing list of weed species, and she highlighted the role of climate change in further complicating weed ecology into the future. Overall, from what Kate has described, I think it's quite likely that we are underappreciating the growing significance of weed issues for New Zealand's environment and people. Keep up the great work, Kate, and I hope that we can nurture a cohort of weed ecologists to support and continue your work into the future to meet the growing weed burden. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Nature Conversations podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, remember to subscribe so that you can be notified of future episodes. If you'd like to help support the production of the podcast, you can do so via my Patreon account. The link is in the episode description. Thanks very much for listening, and be sure to check in again soon.